What an exciting day it is for us here at LULAC, the 2020 Virtual Summit, All for One and One for All, how we are taking action united to transform America. It is my privilege right now to, along with our national president, Domingo Garcia, and our national chief executive officer, Cindy Benavides, to welcome El Hijo del Pueblo. Let me tell you about John Quiñones, who's here from ABC News. John, we welcome you, but before you begin, let me brag about you a little bit. This man has had a 45-year career, one of the most enduring figures in American broadcasting journalism. On top of that, 38 years of those 45 have been at ABC News. He is the recipient of seven national Emmys, and above all, tiene un corazón de paisano, un corazón de amigo. We're so happy to welcome back the son of our community here in Texas and around the nation. We've all adopted you. So let me, without further ado, welcome John Quiñones. And Mr. President, you can also do the more appropriate introduction.
No, go ahead. I'm leaving it up to you.
No, yes, yeah, it's done. John, you're on, brother.
El mero de San Antonio, John Quiñones.
Thank you, guys. Hola, buenas tardes. Thank you for the kind introduction, David. It's an honor to be with all of you at LULAC this afternoon. And before I say anything else, let me tell you all that I would not be here today. I would not be the man I am today. I wouldn't be the correspondent on ABC News and the host of What Would You Do had it not been for the critical, the crucial, the vital work that LULAC has done over all these decades, fighting for Latinos against discrimination, bigotry, racism. I have no doubt that I wouldn't have gotten my first job in broadcasting in San Antonio had LULAC not been there, fighting the good fight for equality and justice and diversity and inclusion, which you're still fighting. You see, when I was a teenager in San Antonio, in my hometown, I was a dreamer. I had dreams I loved writing, and I wanted to be a television reporter. I used to watch Geraldo Rivera on 2020, the only one with a Latino last name, right? Yeah. And I would dream of someday being a correspondent traveling the world like Geraldo for 2020. But despite the fact that the population of San Antonio to this day and back then was 60% Latino, there were very few people who looked like me or sounded like me on radio or on television. But then along came LULAC and its offshoot, this radical group of Mexicanos who some of them had been members of LULAC, some of them were still members of LULAC, who decided that they would picket and demand that the radio and TV stations in San Antonio hire a force on the air, because very few people looked like me, right? There were only like 4 Latinos on television and radio. So they demanded that these stations, and they put on brown berets, and they held placards and posters, and they protested in front of every radio and TV station in San Antonio, threatening to deny the federal communications licenses, to challenge the licenses, the FCC licenses of these stations, if they didn't hire a force that was representative of the population of San Antonio. The argument was simple. The airwaves belong to the people of this great country. They don't belong to Disney or Comcast or Westinghouse or General Electric. They belong to the people. And therefore, the folks that you see on television delivering the news and public service should represent the population of the community they serve. What a thought, right? And at that point, you know, every radio and TV station started grabbing anyone with a decent voice. And I was a freshman at St. Mary's University in San Antonio, and I was hired as an intern at a radio station there in San Antonio. But had it not been for this group, they call themselves the Bilingual Bicultural Coalition on the Mass Media, or the BBC. Had it not been for them and for LULAC, I wouldn't be here. And it's no surprise to me that now, today, I'm a journalist, you know, trying to shine the light with not only the stories that I do, but also the show, What Would You Do? Shining a light on injustice. It's a show that I created because I wanted to hold up a mirror to American society. What would you do? What better tool to do that with, right, than with hidden cameras and on television? We wanted to know How do you unlock the power and the light within each one of us so that we're all better equipped to say, you know, that's wrong, or I can help? What would you do poses that very question. When you witness any kind of discrimination, racism, discrimination, gay bashing, someone being ridiculed because of their religion, bullying, spousal abuse, and that little voice in the back of your head says, do something, do you step in or do you step away? What would you do? I mean, after all, isn't that the real definition of a person's character? It's not what we do when everyone's watching. That's easy. It's what we do even when no one is watching. It's all about doing the right thing. And we face these moral and ethical dilemmas every day in both our personal and professional lives. It doesn't matter what we do for a living. It doesn't matter whether you work in corporate America, whether the legal profession, healthcare, politics, or in my profession, media, journalism. Young people face these dilemmas in high school, at colleges, universities. The question is, what do we do with that opportunity to right a wrong? Do you sound the alarm, lend a helping hand, or do you just mind your own business and keep walking the other way? I think too often we say to ourselves, well, if I don't do anything, who's going to know? When instead we should be saying to ourselves, I would know. And that should be impetus enough to do the right thing, because silence is complicity. You know, in today's America, we have to raise our voices louder than ever before, because these are tough times in this country. You know, I have never seen our country as divided as it is today. All you have to do is look at the current and ugly debates just today about whether all about birthism, whether Kamala Harris, who was born in Oakland, should be able to legally run for the vice presidency. How ridiculous is that? The debate over wearing a mask, the debate over Confederate symbols, the condemnation of Muslims, of Jews, transgenders, the LGBTQ community. And then, of course, the boiling debate over immigration, Latino families being ripped apart at the border, and children being put in cages. What would you do? You know, over all these years, we filmed about 1,000 scenarios in 13 years. And when we started, we thought, you know, we're going to run out of ideas. How many can we do? Here we are, 13 years after we started doing What Would You Do? And we've done about 1,000 scenarios and still growing strong. We're on next Tuesday. The Tuesday after that, we go to El Paso. We're going to be doing a story on the wall. What do you do if you see somebody criticizing two Latino men simply because they're speaking Spanish, accusing them of being in this country illegally? These are all ethical dilemmas that we rip right from the headlines. You don't have to go far. You see them on viral videos on, social media. And I get messages on social media all the time saying, John, I had a what would you do moment today. I thought you were going to come out and save the day. They really do happen, these scenarios. It's even happened to me. You know, here I am, I think I'm a famous television reporter. Before the virus, I was at the airport in Dallas, getting ready to get on a plane back to New York. And I was lucky enough to be flying in first class. So I was in the first class line where it said first class people line up here. And I looked to my left and all the other first class passengers have lined up by mistake in the economy line, which happens, but I was in the right line. But the lady in front of that line looked over to me and said, sir, and I wasn't dressed up. I was wearing jeans and a baseball cap. And she said, sir, are you even in first class? I didn't say a word, I just nodded. And she said, well, the first class passengers are over here. And I just pointed to the sign above my head, but I went back to the back of the line. I didn't want to cause a scene. And on my way back to the back of the line, that lady yelled at me. The announcement was made in English. We speak English in this country. And other people who were in line who knew me from television said, oh my God, John, is this a what would you do scenario? Unfortunately, I said, no, this is real life. And I'm standing in the back of the line, and my only concern at this point was that I was going to have to sit next to this mean lady on the airplane. And I got on the flight and on the plane, and fortunately, she was sitting by herself, right? No surprise there, by the window. And I couldn't resist. As I was walking past her, I leaned over to her and I said, ma'am, My name is John Quiñones, and I do a TV show called What Would You Do? And you would be great for the show. We could use you to play the part of the racist. She gave me another dirty look, but it happens to all of us. Someone wrote on social media the other day, they said, the world would be a better place if we all thought John Quiñones was in the next room monitoring our behavior, because of course, we would be on our best behavior. So how do we do it? How do we become active bystanders instead of passive observers of injustice? I think it's as simple as putting ourselves in the shoes of the victim. You know, in some ways, it's easier for those of us who have been there, who have suffered through racism and discrimination. After all these years of doing the show, I have found that time and again, the people who step in and do the right thing, they sound the alarm, they lend a helping hand, are people who themselves have been the targets of racism and bullying and gay bashing and spousal abuse. They sound the alarm because they know what it's like, how painful it can be. They've been there. And that's why for 91 years, LULAC has been on this beautiful mission, because you guys have been there. And so have I. In many ways, I kind of feel like I was destined to do this kind of show and to create What Would You Do? Because of where I come from and the world that I grew up in and the hurdles that I had to overcome and leap over. I was born in poverty in the barrio on the west side of San Antonio. You know how some people say we were poor, but we didn't know we were poor? We knew we were poor. And we had an old black and white television at the back of the house. My dad was a janitor. My mom cleaned houses on the north side of San Antonio. My dad dropped out of the 3rd grade to pick cotton in Lockhart, Texas. He would tell me stories of how he remembered when he would go to some places in Lockhart and Luling and San Marcos, and there were signs at restaurants that said no Mexicans or dogs allowed. He picked cotton all of his life. And then he became a janitor at the high school, Brackenridge, where I wound up going to high school. My mom dropped out of the 3rd grade also to help support her family, her single mom, and would clean houses, as I said. When I was 6 years old, I spoke not a word of English. You know, even though we were in San Antonio and I was born there, 7 generations of Quiñoneses have lived in San Antonio in Texas. We didn't have to learn English because, as David, as you know, everything is in Spanish in San Antonio. The corner store, the church, the mass, the music we listened to and danced to. And so I didn't have to learn English. And this was before bilingual education. So we didn't go to kindergarten or preschool. We couldn't afford that. So we went straight to the 1st grade, me and my 2 sisters, my older sister Irma and my little sister Rosemary, and to Carvajal Elementary, a block away from my house. And I'll never forget being in Mrs. Gregory's 1st grade class at 10 in the morning, right? I'm twiddling my thumbs because I don't speak English and the teacher doesn't speak Spanish. And at 10 in the morning, the school bell rings. And of course, all the children go out to the playground. It's recess time, right? Where does little Juanito Quiñones go? I walked home. I walked home and I remember going through the front door and my dear departed mother, Maria, saying, Juanito, ¿qué pasó? ¿Qué haces aquí? And I said to her, se acabó. It's over. I love school, Mom. 2 hours and you're done. This is going to work out very nicely. She grabbed me by the ear and dragged me back to Mrs. Gregory's 1st grade class because she knew the value of an education, not having gotten one herself. They used to punish us in school for speaking Spanish. The coaches had big old paddles, wooden paddles with holes drilled in them for extra speed and power. And they would give us 3 spankings on our rear end if they caught us speaking Spanish. I used to shine shoes because my father made $50 a week as a janitor. And on weekends, we'd do yard work. But we still needed money. And I would shine shoes. When I was 8 years old, me and my cousin Joey would go to Guadalupe Street and we'd shine shoes and we'd go to all the cantinas, the bars, because the borrachos, the drunk guys, didn't realize how much they were tipping you. And we made a killing until one day we're coming home at night, late at night, and there were some gang members and they jumped us and they took my rags and my polish and my earnings from the night and the little wooden shoe shine box that I had made from scratch. Took it all, and that was the end of my shoe shining career. When I was 13, my father was laid off from work at the school. And we had no choice but to do what a lot of Latino families in South Texas did. We became migrant farm workers that summer. My mother, Maria, my father, Bruno, and my sisters and I got in the back of these trucks with strangers, people we didn't know, 7 trucks, and headed north on the back of these trucks. 1,700 miles from San Antonio to Northport, Michigan, the cherry capital of the world, where we picked cherries for 75 cents a bucket. And I remember teetering on the top of these ladders overlooking orchards and orchards of cherry trees, and it would take me 2 hours to fill that darn bucket for 75 cents. We did that for 6 weeks, and then we did what all migrant farm workers do. We followed the crops, right? From Michigan to Ohio, a little town called Swanton, just outside Toledo, Ohio, where we picked tomatoes for 35 cents a bushel. And man, I was a champion tomato picker. I would do 100 bushels a day. And my father would do 135 bushels. And my mother would contribute and my sisters would contribute. And we learned the value of the family coming together, right? 35 cents a bushel, 100 bushels, I made $35 a day. That's pretty good. And we learned the value, as so many of our families have learned, the value of us coming together and pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. But I'll never forget being on my knees on the cold, hard ground at 6 in the morning with my father Bruno, looking at a row of tomato plants that for a young 13-year-old boy's eyes seemed to go on for miles and miles. That's what I had to look forward to that day. And my father Bruno looking down saying, Juanito, you want to do this kind of work for the rest of your life? Or do you want to get a college education someday? It was a no-brainer. I mean, I knew I didn't want to do that kind of backbreaking work, but no one believed in me. You know, no one believed in me. When we went back to San Antonio after picking cherries and tomatoes, I would go up to my teachers and my counselors and I would say, can you tell me how I can take advanced placement classes in math, biology, and English? How do I prepare for the SATs or the ACTs? Do you know what my own teachers and my own counselors would say to me? They would look at me and they say, John, it's wonderful that you have this dream of someday being a television reporter, but we think you should try wood shop or metal shop or auto mechanics. Not that there's anything wrong with those wonderful trades. A lot of my relatives make a good hard living doing that. But I wanted to go to college, and my own teachers and my own counselors did what people do on that show, What Would You Do, every Tuesday night. They judged me by the color of my skin and the accent in my voice. But thank God for my mother Maria. Once again, she would rose to save the day. She would say, mijo, my son, mijo, don't be embarrassed of having to wear the same clothes to school every other day. At least we wash those clothes, right? They're clean. She would say, mijo, don't be embarrassed about having to take bean and tortilla tacos for lunch when all the other kids are taking their fancy bologna and white bread. She would say, don't be embarrassed. What matters is what's in here, in your cabeza, and in your brain, and here, in your corazón, in your heart. She was the one that kept me going, and it was during the civil rights movement. And I remembered the words of Martin Luther King, who said, in times of adversity, you gotta have faith. And faith is taking that first step. It doesn't matter if you can't see the entire staircase, right? Just take the first step, because tomorrow there'll be another step, and the next day, another baby step. My first step, following the advice of Martin Luther King, was to get rid of my accent. And I love accents. I am, all kinds of accents, but I knew that if I was going to be like my heroes, Peter Jennings, Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, I was going to have to get rid of my accent. So I enrolled in drama class, and I was also painfully shy in school. I enrolled in drama class, and I remembered that to force myself out of my shell and to enunciate right from a stage. And I tried out for the role of Romeo in Romeo and Juliet for a citywide production in San Antonio. And maybe it's because no one else tried out, but I wound up getting the role. And not only that, the good news was that I got to kiss Juliet, Mary Lou Gomez. And the bad news was that in this very macho, ridiculously macho Mexican school, Rhodes Junior High in San Antonio. I had to wear leotards. I'm just glad there's no YouTube back then to document all that. But I learned how to enunciate and how to stand on a stage and not be afraid and not be shy. And then along came the first hero in my life, which aside from my parents was my English teacher, a Mexicana, Mrs. Gutierrez in the 10th grade. She was the first one who, after everyone else said, you're not college material, no one in your family has ever gone to college, how dare you think you're going to make it in college? When everyone else said that, Mrs. Gutierrez said, John, I love the way you tell stories. I love the way you write your essays for English class. Have you thought about journalism? I said, of course, I've been watching Geraldo all these years. She said, no. Have you thought about maybe writing for the school newspaper? So she introduced me to Mr. Harris at Brackenridge High School, and he was the one who ran the newspaper, and I was hired as a reporter. So I've been doing this since I was 14, right? And within a couple of months, I was the chief of editorials. I was named the chief of editorials for the Brackenridge Times. So there I am writing these big investigative stories like, why are the teachers parking in the students' parking spaces? Tonight, we go undercover and find out. And I loved it. And then along came another hero besides my mom and the teacher. It was a government program called Upward Bound. And I know LULAC has been involved with Upward Bound. It was part of the TRIO programs in this country where the government knew that our schools were doing a lousy job of preparing us for college, right? So they gave you extra courses. They took 10 students from every high school. I don't know what they based their admittance on, because I didn't have a lot of great grades in school. They saw a spark, they saw something, and I was picked as one of the Upward Bound students. And that allowed me to get extra courses on Saturdays, right? And every summer of my high school career, I got to live on a college campus up in San Marcos at Texas State University. And it was because of Upward Bound and that helping hand, much like the work that LULAC has done all these decades, that I was able through scholarships and loans to get into St. Mary's. And then, the bilingual bicultural coalition came along, got me my internship at a country music station at KKYX in San Antonio. And then I got another job in Houston. I got a fellowship to attend Columbia University in New York and got a master's in journalism. And then got my first job in television in Chicago. And it was in Chicago where I did the story that I had wanted to do for a long time about an issue that's still a hot button issue to this very day, illegal immigration. I convinced my news director in Chicago to let me go undercover and go to Mexico. I was 26 years old, right? I looked the part. I spoke only Spanish when I went down there, and he agreed to send me to Mexico and pose as a Mexicano trying to get into the US. I wanted to show what are the push factors that make people so desperate to leave their homes in Mexico, and El Salvador, and Honduras, and Nicaragua, and Colombia, and to come to this country, risking their lives crossing the Rio Grande or Camino del Diablo, the desert's highway in Arizona, to come get a job here as a roofer for very little money, or a dishwasher for very little money, or a cook. How desperate must they be? So I went undercover and I went to Mexico, and I found a coyote who for $300, he thought I was just another Mexicano trying to get across the border. He sold me a fake birth certificate and a fake social security card, all captured on hidden camera. And he says, okay, tonight we will cross the Rio Grande here in Laredo at sunset. I met up with him that night. I told my camera crew first where to hide in the bushes on the Texas side of the Rio Grande so that they could document me swimming across. I went back into Mexico. Back then, as you know, it was very easy to go back and forth across the bridge, the border. And I met up with the coyote, and he puts me on an inner tube, and I floated across the Rio Grande, all captured on camera. And I didn't stop there. From there, I got on a bus, because remember, this was for a story in Chicago, for the local station in Chicago. So we wanted to have a Chicago angle on it. I got on a bus, went back to Chicago, and I went to this restaurant where we had heard that this owner of this restaurant had 7 undocumented workers working for him. And they'd been there 16 weeks and he had not paid them 1 penny. And every time they complained, he would say, hey guys, you get to sleep here in the basement. You get to eat all the food you want. You keep complaining and I'll call immigration, I'll call ICE and have you deported. And that, by the way, happens in this country, as we all know, to this very day. So I went to that restaurant, posing as a kid who just arrived from Mexico and speaking only Spanish, of course. And he hired me, the owner of the restaurant hired me as a dishwasher. So by day, I'm washing dishes. And then at night, I went down and slept with the other Mexican workers next to the dishes and the silverware and the cans of food in the basement. And I still wonder what they must have thought, because in the middle of the, by day, I'm washing dishes with them and bussing tables, right? And then at night, I pulled out a little camera and I started interviewing them about their lives. And they explained to me about how they were being held as virtual indentured servants in that place without a penny of money paid to them. Well, the next day I came back to work, this time wearing a suit, speaking fluent English with a camera crew behind me. And I remember we had to chase the owner of the restaurant through that parking lot because he didn't want to talk to us about what he was doing to those Mexicanos. Well, the day after this aired on CBS Chicago, my crossing the Rio Grande on an inner tube, my working at that restaurant, the US government moved in and they shut down that restaurant. They arrested the owner and they got the Mexican workers the money they were owed and temporary visas to remain here while they worked on their residency. And I knew then that those are the kinds of stories that as a Latino, I could tell better than anyone. I see journalism, I call it a candle in the darkness, you know, or a little flashlight in the darkness. Imagine this room is pitch dark. There's been a huge storm and we can't get out of the house and we're stumbling around, you know. We can't even see our hands in front of our faces. The journalist, you know, he or she is the person with the little candle or the little flashlight, and they can shine it on the darkest corners of this room to illuminate injustice, to illuminate civil rights violations and human rights violations. I think when journalism is done right, and we're not doing it right every day these days, but when it's done right, those are the kinds of stories that we should be telling. That story, crossing the Rio Grande and working at that restaurant, won my first Emmy Award. And Peter Jennings was watching from New York. And they were looking for someone to join the network as a correspondent because one of our correspondents, who was this white guy from New York, Bill Stewart, great reporter, great correspondent, but didn't speak a word of Spanish, at the last minute was sent to cover the war in Central America in Managua, Nicaragua. He stopped at a military checkpoint. He can't communicate with the soldiers, the Sandinista, the government soldiers back then in Nicaragua, the government that the Sandinista rebels were fighting. And they take him out of his van and they start questioning him. He can't communicate. This camera crew is 100 feet away. They start filming it because they think it's funny that he can't communicate with the soldiers, Bill Stewart. And on camera, you see the soldiers put a gun to his head and assassinate him right there on camera, along with his translator. It made, obviously, world news. It was one of the first times that you saw a journalist being killed on camera. And the networks then, in all their wisdom, said, we should hire somebody who speaks Spanish to go cover Latin America, right? What a thought. And there I was in Chicago with my little Emmy from swimming across the Rio Grande. And I was hired to cover Central America. And I spent 15 years traipsing about Cuba, Honduras, you know, every single country in Latin America, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Mexico, you know, Honduras, Colombia, Venezuela. And I loved it. And working with Peter Jennings was a dream come true. I was a foreign correspondent based in Miami, but I would cover all the news in that whole region. Working with Peter was such an honor because this guy was like James Bond. You know, he was like one of the best broadcast anchormen I've ever worked with. And I was intimidated because he was also very intimidating. And as a young reporter, I remember one of the first stories I got was in Nicaragua, where I had an interview with the president, this guy, Daniel Ortega, right? And I had this exclusive interview. And back then it was a big deal to get an interview with Ortega. So I called Peter Jennings in New York And I said, Peter, I got this exclusive interview. He goes, fine, young man. I don't think he knew my name. Fine, young man. I look forward to having you on the air. I hang up with Peter Jennings, and then I get a call from the president's office in Nicaragua canceling the interview. So the network had made a 2-minute hole in the newscast, right, to put my piece in. And now I got to call Peter Jennings, James Bond, and tell him that I'm not going to be able to do it. And I thought I was going to get yelled at or worse, fired. And instead, Peter Jennings gave me some words of advice that I carry with me to this very day. He said, you know, John, this is going to happen again in your career where you will be promised something and someone doesn't deliver. He said, but remember this, don't worry so much about talking to the movers and the shakers of the world. You know, presidents of countries, politicians, the presidents of corporations. Don't worry, he said, about talking to the movers and the shakers of the world. Concentrate on talking to the moved and the shaken. In other words, talk to the real people, the campesinos in Nicaragua and Honduras and Mexico. Because you're Latino, and because you speak Spanish, you understand the language and the mannerisms, you can go into the countryside and get stories that even I, Peter Jennings, can't get. Concentrate on giving a voice to people who don't have a voice. The presidents of countries, they can issue a press release. They can gather the press anytime they want. But it's those folks who don't have that voice that you need to cater to. And man, that's all I did. For the next 15 years, I ran around Latin America and did nothing but stories, a lot of them in Spanish, for World News Tonight. But I wanted to work for 2020 and Primetime Live. And when I was in Colombia, I remembered I was covering the presidential elections there, a story that turned out to be not much of a story. But when I was in my hotel, I looked out my window and I saw some children on the streets in Bogota, the capital of Colombia. And they were running around sniffing something in their sleeves. They would inhale. It was glue, as it turns out. They were getting high on glue. And then at night, we would see them open the manhole covers on the streets of Bogota and climb down into the sewers. And I asked the woman who worked for us down there, I said, who are those kids? And she goes, they're called gamines. Gamines, they're like street urchins. They're runaways, castaways, children nobody wants. And they live in the sewers, 300 of them. And I couldn't believe it. And I said, is anyone trying to help them? She goes, well, the military, they don't want to go down there. They want to clean up the streets, but they don't want to go into the dark world in the sewers that the kids control. So what they do, the military and the police, is they open the manhole covers, they pour gasoline down there, and they light a match to try to burn them out. And she said, there is one man, his name is Jaime Jaramillo. Jaime is a wealthy industrialist here in Colombia who makes a lot of money finding oil for American oil companies in Latin America. But at night, when he comes home, he can't sleep, knowing that there are children who live in these conditions. So he goes down into the sewers, he puts on some waders, some boots, with a loaf of bread, 6-pack of Cokes, and and some sandwiches, and he will try to do what he can for the children of the sewer. He's trying to build an orphanage. And I said, we got to meet this man. And we were introduced to Jaime Jaramillo. He showed me an album of pictures of the children he had saved out of the sewers, some of them with their faces melted from the fires that the police and the military had started to try to burn them out. I called New York and I said, man, we got to do a story on this. And it's not just a 2-minute story for the evening news for Peter Jennings. This is for like 2020, right? Or Dateline, or 60 Minutes, but at ABC, it's 2020. And I called the executive producer and he said, John, if you're crazy enough to want to go into the sewers to do this kind of story, who am I to say no? So they sent my camera crews down there and we spent 2 weeks in the sewer systems. Can you imagine where the children lived? And we felt so embarrassed because we're wearing waders and masks and gloves. Meanwhile, these children are barefoot, wearing shorts and a t-shirt. This is where they lived. We met a 16-year-old girl who had just given birth. Can you imagine starting life in the sewers next to the rivers of waste with all the germs and the disease that can fester? I did that story, brought it back to New York, and the day after it aired, American viewers sent in $1 million in donations. And Jaime Jaramillo, this man who was trying to start an orphanage, was able to open one up and pull all of the kids out of the sewers. Again, the power of that camera when you shine it, in this case, in the darkest corners of the world. That story won all these awards. And then I started doing more stories for primetime in 2020. And then that's all I did for about 10 years. And then about 13 years ago, I came up with this idea to do a hidden camera show about ethics and morals in America. And we started with What Would You Do? And some of the stories that we do for the show are funny. We did one where, what do you do if somebody's stealing a bicycle at the park, right? What if it's a black man? What if it's a white guy? What if it's an attractive young woman? And it's amazing how people, you know, their reactions will differ in each one of those instances. The more serious ones are the ones that I love telling and pursuing. Like I said, in 2 weeks, we're going to El Paso. We're going to do the wall. We shot this before COVID, so we didn't have to wear the masks. But the ones that I love are those that deal with homelessness and discrimination and racism. We did one where we had a person walking down the street and suddenly they collapsed. You don't know if they passed out from a heart attack or they just passed out from the cold or the heat. All you know is that they're laying on the sidewalk. And first we did it with a well-dressed businesswoman, right, in her 40s. She's walking along, an actress who's a stunt artist, so she falls very convincingly. She passes out, and immediately, within seconds, when it was a white, middle-aged woman, people stepped in, they put a coat over her because it was cold, and they called 911 for her. It was pretty amazing. We said, wow, every single time. But then I said, but wait a minute. What if we switch things up? And instead of, you know, an attractive middle-aged woman who's a businesswoman, clearly well-dressed, what if it's a homeless person who's walking down and collapses? So we got an actor to play that role. Elderly, disheveled, dirty, smelly, bearded, about 80 years old, carrying a beer can in his hand. We had an actor play that role, a stunt artist who fell very convincingly. When it was the homeless man, 88 people walked by and no one would stop to lend a helping hand. We were blown away. So after we saw this happen over and over again, we decided, well, I guess if you're homeless, you're not going to get a lot of help. So I was about ready to come out with the cameras and tell everyone it's What Would You Do? When suddenly we didn't see anything on the hidden camera, but we heard the tapping of a walking cane on a sidewalk. Tap, tap, tap. And then into the frame of the hidden camera comes this African-American woman who's stumbling along with a cane because she has suffered a stroke. And guess what? She's homeless herself. And guess what? She stops to help. And she starts asking people, excuse me, does someone have a cell phone? Because of course she didn't. Can someone call 911 for this man who's on the ground? 37 more people are stepping over him and minding their own business and not getting involved. She then stumbled down to him. She labored because she remembers she's in a walking cane, and she did something we didn't expect. She takes the beer can out of the actor's hands and she throws it in the trash can as if she was thinking, maybe if we give him a little bit of dignity, maybe then people will stop and help. Well, guess what? 58 more people go by and no one is stopping. She then made a fist, I remember because the camera was really tight on her, and she made a fist to the heavens as if she was cursing God himself. And she said, she was angry. She goes, how can you let this happen? And then she stumbled down again, and we could hear this because the man on the ground, the homeless actor, was wearing a wireless mic, right? And she said to him, sir, I don't know your name, but I'm gonna call you Billy. And she said, Billy, my name is Marsha Banner. And don't you worry, my man, I'm homeless too. So I'm gonna stay here until help arrives. And finally, people stepped in and covered him, and we came out and we got our cameras, and on the excitement of all that, we lost our hero. This woman who had stopped to help the man who was down slipped away. Now we knew her name, so we put it on What Would You Do a few weeks later. And the day after it aired, we got hundreds of phone calls and emails and social media because we said she was homeless, with people asking, how can we help? How can we help her? We want to give her something. They started collecting money. So now they've collected $8,000 and we got to find her to give her the money. How do you find a homeless person? So we spent 2 weeks in Newark, New Jersey, looking for Marcia Bonner, this woman, and we had her picture and we posted it everywhere. And finally, we found her. My producer said, John, you gotta come interview her about what she did. We'll do an update. So I sat on some church steps with Marcia and I showed her on my laptop the piece. And I said, remember me? And she goes, I remember the man who fell, yes. And I said, well, you caused quite a stir because on Facebook, they have created a picture of you and they're calling it Touched by an Angel, Touched by a Hero. And they raise money for you. And she goes, I said, do you consider yourself a hero? She goes, I don't know. So we got her the $8,000 in the bank. We got her medicine that she was supposed to be taking for her heart condition. We got her a place to live. And the thing that made her most excited of all, we got her own cell phone. So I said, from now on, Marcia, you can call 911 whenever you see something disturbing. But at the end of the night, I said to her, you know, Marcia, people are calling you a hero. They're calling you an angel. Do you consider yourself one? And she gave me this deadpan look I'll never forget. She goes, no way, John Quiñones, no way. She said, let me tell you what happened. I said, tell me. She said, I think God put me on that corner, on that street, on that day, because he knew you were there with your What Would You Do cameras, and he wanted to teach people a lesson. So what better way to teach that lesson than through the eyes of someone who has been homeless herself? So I leave you with that message tonight. The next time you see something disturbing and the little voice in the back, you witness an injustice, and the little voice in the back of your head says, do something. Remember the words and the actions of this woman, Marcia Bonner, a woman who was homeless and she suffered a stroke, and yet she stopped to help a stranger. He was white, she's black, not that that should matter. She stopped to help a stranger, not because she was going to be on national television, she didn't know that, not because she was going to get $8,000 in the bank and a place to live and medicine for her heart and her own cell phone. She didn't know that. She did it because, as my dear Mother Maria would say, her corazón, her heart, told her it was the right thing to do. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, John. Thank you. That's a beautiful. It's been quite a journey with you this evening, and anyone familiar with your work knows everything you've shared tonight, it is your life. I want to turn it over to Domingo and to Cindy because I know that we all have questions, but I want to defer to them to begin. Domingo, okay. Cindy?
Cindy.
Sure, gracias. Thank you so much, John. And I just kept on watching you. I've been watching the live feed and everyone sending you a lot of love and admiration from Facebook and from our webpage. And I wanted to ask you, John, you know, we're living in really uncertain times. We're living during a global pandemic where Latinos, is clear, are the essential workers. As someone who has been a farm worker, as someone who has covered the issue of farm workers, could you talk a little bit about how do we humanize our immigrant community? How do we make sure that we reach the hearts of people? Because we're living in such a polar time, and a time where our narratives are being completely skewed. We're living in a time where our ethnicity, as we saw in El Paso, makes us targets.
Yeah.
¿Qué nos recomiendas?
You gotta speak up, man. We got to get together and raise our voices, you know, like Cesar Chavez did, right? And like Dolores Huerta has done. And I know that sounds like it's not enough because it hasn't made all the difference in the world, but what choice do we have? We need to get the media, and I blame myself, to cover more of these stories and to give a damn, quite frankly. We need to make a lot of noise. You know, we need to cause trouble. Look, the reason things are changing a little bit in this country right now is because of the tragic death of George Floyd. You know, had it not been for the protests in the streets, we wouldn't see half of the efforts, at least, that appear to be being made in the right direction. So we just need to get the word out, and we need to make sure that we talk to not the experts, not the talking heads out of Washington about this particular issue, in this case, migrant farm workers, but to the workers themselves, to be able to take our cameras into those farms and to those fields where too often we're denied access, right? I know because I've tried, but we just have to keep pushing. And I can tell you that certainly at ABC, we have made a strong commitment now to devote a lot of time and airtime and money and resources, because too often, you know, the networks will say, we don't have enough money to send a camera crew and spend a week down there in Michigan or Ohio or in California. We just, you guys, you need to also keep calling us and keep, you know, pushing us and keep demanding. And also, by the way, as LULAC, the ability to talk to the president of CBS News and ABC News and NBC News and CNN and get meetings with them and demand that the story get covered. If not now, when? We got to do it. We just have to keep pushing harder than ever and take advantage of the moment, because the moment is right.
Domingo, did you have a question you'd like to ask?
Yeah. By the way, John, me and you have something in common. My very first job was as a shoeshine boy. I did the exact same thing. I hung out at the bars in Oak Lawn.
How much did you charge?
Try to make money and sell Dallas Morning News extras also.
How much did you charge?
As a side hustle there when I was 10. But I wanted to ask you, what do you think we can do? One of the things we talked about, not only are Latinos underrepresented in the media in terms of, you know, news, but there are no Latino shows on ABC. I mean, George Lopez left a long time ago, and there are no other shows to replace him. And when we see NBC, CBS, Warner, etc., we're not seeing that. What can we do as individuals, as organization, to try to get more Latinos into the mainstream of media? Because the African Americans have been fairly successful. I got to give them kudos and credit, but Latinos are still underrepresented all over the media. What do you recommend we do?
We're too humble, man. We're too humble. You know, my father was just like that. You know, whatever the patron said, whatever the lady at the house said, whatever she would pay us for cutting that tree or cutting that lawn, you know, ellos saben, you know, it's a beautiful thing that our people are so humble, and I don't want to lose that. But on the other hand, it's not going to get us anywhere. You know, we have to be more demanding, and that doesn't mean you burn down buildings or, you know, or cause chaos, but you do, you know, as John Lewis would say, create good trouble and demand meetings with the heads of these studios. George Lopez is a friend of mine and so darn committed to making a difference, and as angry as they come, but at least he has access to agencies that have access to the networks. My agents at United Talent in Los Angeles know the president of you know, Disney Entertainment. We have access, and we just need to get together and create this list of demands that we need to present to them, that you need to present them. And as LULAC, you have tremendous respect and tremendous power. Don't be afraid to use it. And again, I think—
No, I mean, we've been meeting with the meatpacking plants, by the way. That's another story, John. Me and Sydney were in Clinton, North Carolina, wow, at a hog slaughtering plant. Wow. And I've been to a chicken processing plant in Springdale, Arkansas, and a beef one in Greenlee, Colorado, where the majority of the workers are Latinos or refugees, and in backbreaking conditions. And they've unfortunately been the victims of the COVID-19 epidemic disproportionately. And we've been meeting with the CEOs as well as the workers, trying to improve worker safety, because OSHA is AWOL. You know, they're not putting any pressure. President Trump said I think the War Production Act said they were essential workers, and they almost find them as disposable workers, as not just essential workers. So we're doing that with the meatpacking industry, and we've had some pretty good success right now. But we do need to follow up with the—
well, you know, and you need to remind the heads of these networks that of the buying power that Latinos have in this country now. What is it, $3 trillion buying power? Latinos watch more television, get their news from more often from television than any other ethnic group in America. You know, we love watching television, and we still do. And so there's tremendous clout. And if you don't have to do it because it's the right, you know, conscionable thing to do it because of the money. the fact is, Latinos buy a lot of stuff, and it makes sense for them to cater to this giant of an audience.
Hey, John, let me interject just a question here. And Hector Barreto says it's not about civil rights only, it's about silver rights, which is what you're talking about, economics.
Plata.
Nuestro gran amigo Edward almost dijo una vez, we have to learn to kick envidia in the butt, but he used another word. How do we as a community, instead of being divided, is it the elusive target for us to one day say, ¿sabes qué? Trabajando juntos, working together, we do more. What do you think about that?
It's a little tough because, you know, it's the Cubans in Miami feel differently than the Mexicans in San Antonio, than sometimes the Puerto Ricans in New York. So it's hard to put us into one big jar and say we're one monolithic, you know, power. But it would be wonderful, wouldn't it, to be able to get together for once and look at our common interests and our common failings and our common, you know, needs. It's a little tough, but God knows we have enough Mexicanos in California and Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. It is the largest ethnic group. If we can start there, if we can start with just that group and then try to incorporate the Puerto Ricans in New York and the Venezuelans and Colombians in Miami.
They might say start over there in New York and then they'll end up over here in LA. Cindy, your turn, young lady. ¿Qué más?
Claro que sí, John. One of my favorite quotes is from Dolores Huerta, who is my shiro. And it's every moment is an organizing opportunity, every person a potential activist, every minute a chance to change the world. And I'm wondering, John, for everyone that's tuning in right now, what would be your message for those individuals that are introverts, that are shy, that don't know if it's them? What can they be doing as an individual, as LULACers? We're ardent, passionate activists, but for, you know, those individuals that are tuning in for the first time, ¿qué les dices?
Don't take no for an answer. You have to, sounds like a cliche, but you have to believe that you have the capacity to change things. I got to tell you, I was incredibly painfully shy. I wouldn't raise my voice. I had a heavy Mexican accent. I would say, "This is my shirt, those are my shoes," and people would make fun of me. And I was determined as ever because of my mother, primarily Maria, who would tell me, "Mijo, you're just as good as the kids who live on the other side of the track. No te agüites." You have it within you. That you can be your own worst enemy by not having the belief in yourself that you can change things and that things will happen. Because you know what, one little step at a time. That wonderful quote from Martin Luther King that I love. It doesn't matter if you can't see the entire staircase. You don't have to get it all at once. Start a little bit at a time. Start by getting this job or that job, or by learning this trait and reading more and asking more. The reason I got my first job in television in Chicago was, David, you don't start in Chicago. You start in a little bitty town in McAllen or Peoria, Illinois. I started in Chicago out of Columbia. Why? Because one night at Columbia when I was a student, the president of CBS News, a guy named Richard Salant, was a guest speaker, right, to 120 journalism students. He gave us talk that night. Every Monday we had a different speaker, Peter Jennings, Dan Rather, Walter Cronkite. This night was the president of CBS News, a big deal. And after that, I, had the guts, and it took a lot, but I pushed myself to go up to him and say, "Mr. Salant, I want to interview you for my master's thesis," which was a bunch of BS. I wanted to give them my resume, but I needed to get my foot in the door, right? So he said, "Okay, call my assistant and set up a meeting, and I'd be glad to meet with you." So I called the next day, and we set up a meeting 2 weeks later. And I go to West 57th Street, the CBS studios, and there's Mike Wallace and Walter Cronkite, and man, I was on cloud nine. And I go to meet the president of CBS News, and I sat down and I did this BS interview with him, whatever. I was asking some questions. And then at the end of the interview, I reached into my coat pocket and said, by the way, Mr. Salant, I'm graduating from school this May, and I brought along my resume, and I thought, and he looked at me and he shook his head. He knew he had been had, but the next day I got a call from one of the vice presidents of CBS News, and he said, John Lane was his name, and John said, I just got a call from the president of CBS News, and he says that we should interview you. He describes you as a very enterprising young man. And it was because it took ganas, right? It took that wherewithal, that determination to just go with it. You know, what do you have to lose? In my case, I didn't have a job. I got my
or the Quiñones of Quiñones, right? John, let me ask you to change. Segue. This year, last year we honored Jim Acosta with CNN for kind of courage in profiling courage in terms of when he's interviewing Trump. And we've seen how the Trump administration treated Acosta, kind of banning him from the White House. We saw what he did to Jorge Ramos when he said, we don't need Univision here, we'll go back to Univision. How do you see this administration and this election coming up in terms of how Trump has treated and been hostile toward Latino and Latina reporters, and how that's going to play out in November?
I think it's going to hurt him. I don't cover politics. I should preface this by saying that, and I don't cover Washington. I watch it much as you do from afar, but I'm glued to the news every single day because every day is something even crazier than the day before. I really think this is finally going to hurt the president. Today, the New York Post magazine, which is a newspaper, the New York Post newspaper, which is a pretty conservative, newspaper, in an editorial warned the president not to be so petty and in condemning in his language of women, especially, but of course, more specifically, Kamala Harris, because it's hurting. And in the end, the newspaper asked the question, do you want to get reelected? Because he's doing everything to sabotage, it seems, himself, and using the media to beat us up and call us fake news. I worked too darn hard. I studied so hard. I got my ass shot at in Nicaragua and El Salvador. My producers were kidnapped in Panama throughout my career in these 38 years. To be called fake, I mean, everything we do is just an effort to shine that light. And we check and double check. Every script that I write has gone over by a fine-tooth comb from our standards people at ABC News and our lawyers. It's such an insult. I don't get it. I don't know. It must be a move in desperation, perhaps, on his part, seeing that the polls show him trailing now so far behind Joe Biden that maybe he's just, saying the hell with it, and I'm going to attack wherever I have to. But it's been particularly painful against people like Jim.
John, before we wrap, because I know we're running out of time, and I turn it over to our CEO, I wanted to share something with you. At the BBC that you spoke of at the beginning of your career, two people were at the head of that I remember, among two or three. One of them was a man named Mario Compián. The other one was a woman, a young lady named Rosie Castro, the mother of Joaquin and Julian Castro.
That's right.
Isn't it something? History can sometimes come back and tap you on the shoulder. Madam CEO, it is all yours.
Thank you so much. And John, it's such a pleasure having you with us. We could listen to you on hours on end, and I can only tell you from the feed that you have a lot of supporters, a lot of LULACers tuning in who send you a lot of love and are just asking that you actually write a book of all that you've witnessed and all that you've seen throughout your years. President Garcia, as always, thank you for your leadership. And David, thank you for moderating our entire National Virtual Summit, for making it so successful. I want to just remind folks who are tuning in that tomorrow we have one more day left. We will be kicking it off at 10 in the morning with trainings around communications, fundraising, social media. And then at 2 p.m., we will have Jill Biden joining us in a very special town hall to talk about COVID-19. Y otra vez, muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos. Gracias.